the activities of the Cold War International History Project and the Romania Initiative. Since we're actually going live on the web, let me say a few words about the Wilson Center before I talk about the event today. The Wilson Center is the nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. It is a nonpartisan institute for advanced study and a neutral forum for open, serious, and informed dialogue. It brings preeminent thinkers to Washington for extended periods of time to interact with policymakers through a large number of programs and projects. The center seeks to separate the important from the inconsequential and to take a historical and broad perspective on the issues. At the Wilson Center, the Cold War International History Project and the History and Public Policy Program support the full and prompt release of historical materials by governments on all sides of the Cold War, and seek to accelerate the process of integrating new sources, materials, and perspectives from the former communist bloc with the historiography of the Cold War. It also seeks to transcend barriers of language, geography, and regional specialty to create new links among scholars interested in Cold War history. Among the activities undertaken by the project to promote the same are the periodic bulletin, copies of which are available outside, the project's virtual archive, the largest collection of declassified, translated communist archival documents available online, as well as international scholarly meeting, conferences, and seminars. The History and Public Policy Program also established late last year a exchange program with the Romanian Cultural Institute to bring young Romanian scholars to Washington for a short period of time to interact with people at the Wilson Center, to research at numerous resources available in the Washington area. The first of the Romanian short-term scholars is Cristian Vasile, who will be talking today about Romania's communist cultural Cold War, 1947 to 1960. Let me just say a few words about Cristian. He is a research fellow at the Nicolae Iorga History Institute of the Romanian Academy, and the co-editor of the Contemporary History series published by the Humanitas Publishing House in Bucharest. Previously, he was the coordinator of the Advisory Presidential Commission for the Study of the Communist Dictatorship in Romania, also known as the Tismaneanu Commission, and served as scientific secretary for the commission. His academic research focuses on culture and society in the 20th century Romania, and more specifically on the role of the church and the state under communism. He authored or co-authored a number of books, including his most recent The Perfect Acrobat, Leonte Răutu, The Masks of Evil, published in 2008, and co-authored with Vladimir Tismaneanu, so a scholar at the Wilson Center now, as well as the Romanian Orthodox Church in the First Communist Decade in 2005, and between Vatican and Kremlin, the Greek Catholic Church under communist regime in 2003. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Bucharest, and as I stated before, he is the first of a series of young Romanian scholars coming to Washington over the course of this year and now over the course of next year. Cristian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mircea. I am pleased to see here and to welcome some dear friends, American Romanians. Many of them helped me with suggestions regarding this paper. The main objective of this paper is to analyze both the decision-making process behind the dynamics of the Cold War Romanian cultural diplomacy and the propaganda agitation department's strategy to enroll and to manipulate the Romanian intellectuals and artists within the anti-capitalist and anti-cosmopolitanism front during Stalinism. The chronological limits, 1947, 1960, circumscribe a period of history of the Romanian culture and diplomacy, for it encompasses the period of time marked by the creation of the Cominform, September 1947, and by the beginning of a softening in tone of East-West relation and diminishing control over the literature and arts by the Communist Party. I will try to look at the mechanisms employed at the level of cultural diplomacy by identifying its characteristics in the context of international relations between 1947 and 1960. My paper will focus both on the cultural diplomacy, the later generated by the policy shifts, while searching for the causes of the Romanian propaganda's vehement stand during the battle against the West. In addition, the paper will dwell upon relevant biographical profiles and significant political and administrative actions of those who were involved in cultural external propaganda. This particular section will heavily rely upon Romanian Communist Party Central Committee's Department for External Relations archives, the archives of Agitprop, and the Ministry of Culture documents. My working hypothesis is that the Propaganda and Agitation Department, the Agitprop, has had an overwhelming role in defining the main elements of the communist cultural policy in Romania and abroad. The Agitprop promoted the ideological uniformity and enrollment of the intellectual and artistic elite. Therefore, until 1953-1954, the Romanian communist regime humbly imitated the Soviet anti-Western cultural policies, which made it, in the later years, more difficult for Romanian writers and film directors, actors, to penetrate and or have access to Western cultural milieus and scenes. Trying to complete the research, I use primary sources from the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party, Propaganda and Agitation Department, preserved at the National Archives, preeminently at the National Archives in Bucharest. I try to analyze also the influence of the major international events of the Cold War, 1948 Soviet-Yugoslav split, Soviet-Israeli dispute, Geneva conferences, and the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, upon Romanian cultural parties' cultural policies towards Serbian, Jewish, Hungarian minorities living in Romania, and on the other hand towards Yugoslavia, Israel, Hungary within the bilateral relations. Immediately after the World War II, the Romanian pro-communist government, led by Groza, orientated cultural international relations towards the USSR. By the autumn of 1947, the subordination to the Moscow's interests was obvious. In addition to the Association for the Strengthening of the Relations with the Soviet Union, ARLOS, and other Soviet-type friendship societies with Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, the Institute for Cultural Relations with the foreign countries pursued an intense activity in the early 1950s, but the contacts with the capitalist states were at the lowest level. Arles and this aforementioned institute and the external oriented division from the Ministry of Arts and Information, Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party's Department for External Relations and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs represented the institutional framework for external cultural propaganda. With the exception of the last two, these institutions were put under the supervision of the Agitprop, whose leader, Leon Tărăutu, published in a 1949 speech entitled Against Bourgeois Cosmopolitanism and Objectivism in the Field of Social Sciences, ideologically mimicked the newly instated Zhdanovist principle. This manifesto of Stalinist dogmatism in Romania was the epitome of the cultural ideological external propaganda philosophy until the early 1960s. As I previously mentioned, one of the main tools used by the authorities, the communist authorities, was the Association for the Strengthening the Relations with the Soviet Union, an organization supported by famous and opportunist writers and intellectuals. One of the association's tasks was to promote and spread the Russian language within Romanian society. Between 1945 and 1960, Russian was extremely privileged by the communist regime and not perceived as a foreign language in official levels. Meanwhile, the other languages, French, English, and German, were neglected at schools and universities, but the effective penetration of Russian in the Romanian schools was made more difficult because of the lack of skilled teaching cadre. In order to encourage Romanian cultural convergence with the Soviet Union, the pro-communist government had introduced Russian as subject matter in Romanian schools in 1945. The Ministry of Education, led by Social Democrat minister, did not use the ideological reasoning, but instead used geopolitical explanation for the introduction of Russian language to school curriculum. He argued that all Romania's neighbors, except Hungary, belonged to the great family of Slavic peoples. Romania was surrounded by Slavic language countries, most notably the USSR, and moreover, Russian literature, mainly the technical one, could help students improve their skills and practical abilities. However, until the autumn of 1947, the Romanian government was not politically uniformed. It included also bourgeois and pro-capitalist ministers, such as Tătărescu, vice president of the cabinet and foreign affairs minister. This hindered the communists in their efforts to Stalinize the education sector. The overwhelming majority of the intellectual elite was French-speaking and had pro-Western stances. Its pro-Soviet stand was only for appearances' sake. Moreover, in many private high schools throughout the country, French language teaching continued even after 1944, and as a result, the education department had to regulate the exam procedures. For example, in January 1946, the Ministry of Education issued the rules concerning the French baccalaureate, prolonging for 5 years the regulations regarding French high school exam. After September 1947, rapidly occurring events jeopardized Romanian-French cultural relations and especially the bilateral cultural agreements. Moreover, the communist leadership and the government rejected a French proposal to create a school in Romania for the children of the Western diplomats, as well as forbade the functioning of the French Library and the Italian Cultural Institute in Bucharest. France was then labeled by the Soviet and Romanian foreign propaganda as being yoked by the Marshall Plan and therefore potentially dangerous. The French cultural influence in East Central Europe had to be strictly limited. On the other hand, in the fall of 1947, an insignificant group of Romanians living abroad, especially in France, gathered in Paris in order to express their solidarity with the Romanian government. They decided to send a telegram to Prime Minister stating their gratitude for courageous undertaking regarding Romania's economical growth, cultural revival, and so on, as well as preoccupation for defending national sovereignty. In fact, the preparations for this reunion were guided from Bucharest and follow the removal of Tătărescu, the foreign affairs minister. Immediately after this event, in December 1947, the Groza cabinet issued a decision concerning especially the cultural context with Western Europe and the United States. According to the new governmental order, all commitments made in the past by both Romanian governments and state cultural institutions regarding the artistic and intellectual cooperation with foreign countries had to be checked out by a commission that included the undersecretaries of state from three departments: foreign affairs, interior, and propaganda. In October 1948, during a communist secretariat gathering, Anna Pauker, the successor of Tătărescu as foreign minister, presented the demands of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs regarding the creation of a school in Bucharest for French-speaking diplomats, children, who were in Bucharest with their parents. Not only did she argue for the rejection of the Quai d'Orsay's request, but called for the closing of the French Institute in Bucharest, implying it was an espionage agency. Under the pretext of French abuses against Romanian officials and citizens, the Romanian Foreign Affairs Minister insisted on closing the French Institute, even at the risk of losing the Romanian school in France, as a result of predictable French retaliation policy. The Communist Secretariat approved in principle Pauker's proposal to refuse the founding of a French school in Bucharest, and also decided that in the future the French and Italian institutes would be shut down. The closing of the French Institute was also on the agenda of the next Secretariat meeting in November, when Pauker again invoked the provocations of the French government. The Romanian Foreign Affairs Minister accused Paris of suppressing both the Romanian Association of Friends and its newspaper. Pauker also pretended that French police arrested both the top leaders of the association and the French citizens, together with Romanian excursionists who supported the actions of this association. In fact, the Romanian diplomats in France carried things too far and went beyond their competence, and the French authorities reacted promptly. Despite such strong opposition, the French Institute continued to function until 1950, although the Romanian government demanded France diplomatic officers to seize the support for it. In fact, the French library in Bucharest remained open to Romanian students and scholars because the French legation's information office took up some of the institute's duties. American, British, and Italian diplomatic missions took similar actions and used their offices in order to continue spreading cultural propaganda, books, movies, and so on. To prevent this type of subterfuge and to frighten Bucharest readers and other frequenters of Western crypto institutes and libraries, the communist leadership forbade the activity of all such information offices while arresting Romanian library goers. Among the latter was Șerban Papacostea, a recent history graduate from the University of Bucharest and the usual reader of the French library. In March 1950, Romanian authorities imprisoned Papacostea for administrative punishment, that is 6 months forced labor without any legal justification, without a trial and a sentence. He was jailed together with other hundreds of students at the Danube Black Sea Canal, the site of a well-known Romanian labor camps, where many intellectuals, bourgeois and representative of rich peasantry were exterminated, especially during 1949 and 1953. The Romanian agitprop leader, Leonta Răutu, encouraged and urged the writers to approach the topic of the construction of the canal, of the artificial waterway. For example, in 1951, an extraordinarily talented young prose writer published an 800 pages novel praising the canal as a remarkable achievement and falsifying the historical facts. On the other hand, as I anticipated, Romania had lost the school in France, together with its buildings, from Fontenay-aux-Roses, near Paris. In fact, it was a huge loss for the Romanian culture. This school was established in 1921 due to the efforts of Nicolae Iorga, the Romania's greatest historian, and its model was the American and West European schools or academies founded in the Greek and Roman classical culture cities, Athens and Rome. Instead of Rome and Athens, the parliament preferred Rome and Paris. And among the main goals were combating the hostile propaganda, especially what was called Hungarian historiographical campaign in the context of 1920 Trianon Treaty. The pursuit of advanced research, especially in history and philology, the school offered grants and fellowships for Romanian researchers, artists, and students. In return, they had to present conferences and lectures. The school from Fontenay-aux-Roses was both boarding school and institute of cultural propaganda. In fact, the law regarding the education reform from 1948 and the deterioration of French-Romanian relations closed the Romanian school in France. A part of the library was lost or sold. After 1948, a few former fellows of the school, together with other émigrés, created a Romanian Center for Humanistic Research, a continuation of the school, and they elected Mircea Eliade, the well-known historian of religions, as honorary president of the center. In 1948, also, Romanian lost this school, which was a sort of an intellectual embassy, and moreover, the young generation was hindered to attend Western, European and French universities. The only option was Soviet Union's educational network. On the other hand, communist Romania's universities received students mainly from the socialist pro-Soviet bloc. A 1954 report concerning the situation of foreign students during the academic year 1953-1954 pointed out that the numerous groups of students came from North Korea, Greece, Yugoslavia. Many of them, it must be stressed, were in Romania as political refugees too, and only a few from Western countries. The monthly stipend provided to 700 foreign students was 600 lei, a reduced grant. Some students from capitalist countries such as Finland and Argentina objected to the way were treated by the Romanian authorities and complained vigorously, showing the bad housing, inadequate health care, and unhealthy or expensive food served at the canteens, universities' canteens. Only in the spring of 1954, the Romanian authorities, the Minister of Interior Trade, took the necessary measures to establish a special canteen for these foreign students. That is, inexpensive prices per daily meal, for example. But like in the Soviet case, the efforts to attract and please the foreign students were not always successful, and one could talk, at least for the beginning of 1950s, about a Romanian failure to assure the comfort of foreign students. Another difficult task for the communist government was the reconciliation with Hungary. That is, the improvement of bilateral cultural relations, especially. In November 1947, the two governments signed a bilateral cultural agreement, which was adopted by the Romanian Communist Parliament in April 1948, in the same day with a law concerning the ratification of the Convention for the Cultural Cooperation, which stated that, I quote, hostile forces hindered the two people in knowing each other better and hampered free cultural exchanges, end of quote. Romania and Hungary reiterated their commitments to remove all elements liable to offend the other part, such as actions, words, references from textbooks, public representations, and other cultural manifestations. One of the main objectives of these agreements was the enrollment of the two countries within the so-called Front of Progressive Culture, whose purpose was to create a culture purified both from nationalistic and cosmopolitan tendencies. Besides these cultural conventions, organizations such as Romanian-Hungarian Cultural Society sprang up to help mediate closer cultural relations. Undoubtedly, the improvement was real, but after the Hungarian Revolution, and especially after 1958, the bilateral relations worsened, being compromised both by the closing of Hungarian University in Cluj and by the Romanian Communist Party's instrumentalization of the Romanian national feelings. In 1948, similar association of friendship were set up to improve the cultural relations with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The later organizations of friendship with Yugoslavia had been largely inactive in Romania because of the Tito-Stalin split. Romanian officials closely monitored after 1948, all its members and all those suspected of pro-Tito stances. Some of them were even arrested in Romania. Yugoslav external propaganda made important efforts to promote its cultural values in post-war Romania, especially during 1945 and the beginning of 1948. Romania had an important Yugoslav, Serbian actually, minority, living mainly in Banat and Arad County, near the Yugoslav border. This reality also had consequences for closer cultural contacts and exchanges during this period, 1945-1948. Moreover, probably after Stalin, Tito was the most praised foreign leader by the Romanian communist-controlled press between 1945 and 1947. Pro-Yugoslav propaganda grew with the occasion of Tito's visit in Romania in November 1947. Also, the Yugoslav model of socialism was praiseworthy. The Romanian communists encouraged the publication of materials which pleaded for the implementation of the Yugoslav cultural structures. The importance of the relations with Tito is given by the fact that the Romanian legation in Belgrade, in Belgrade were sent important intellectuals such as Tudor Vianu as ambassador and literary critic Frunzetti as cultural attaché. The latter published in the fall of 1947 an article in an important communist journal titled "The Concept of Culture in New Yugoslavia," a writing which soon after its publication became out of date, after Stalin brought the ideological charges against Yugoslavia in obedience to Moscow orders. The Romanian communist authorities launched an angry campaign against Tito. There are also some cultural aspects of the Romanian-Yugoslav dispute due to Soviet instigation. Romanian Communist Party grieved over the suicide cases amongst pro-Yugoslav, pro-Soviet Yugoslav intellectuals, the tensioned relations between Yugoslavia and Romania had also a strong effect both over cultural activities and bilateral cooperation. It also caused harm to the Serbian minority in Romania, preeminently to cultural union of the Slavs. For example, the participation of the Romanian Serbian folk group in the May Day anniversary festivities in Bucharest aroused doubts among the members of the top communist leadership. For example, in April 1949, at a communist gathering, Anna Pauker, the Foreign Affairs Minister, opposed their participation, and she gave voice of her indignation. In the end, the Communist Party approved their participation, but only with strict conditions. Also, the secret police and the party propaganda officials closely watched every policy shifts of Tito's Yugoslavia, but also the Romanian Serbs' state of mind. A 1949 agitprop document concerning the allegedly espionage and hostile propaganda activity carried on by Yugoslavia mentioned that at the beginning of I quote, "At the beginning one noticed much consternation within Serbian minority, the majority of them saying that do not believe that Tito produced a real political change in Yugoslavia, but it is Tito new and sly political tactics," end of quote. I must say that the Institute for cultural relations with foreign countries, imitated the Soviet Vox, all-union society for cultural relations with foreign countries, and did not have any autonomy. Each cultural project and invitation of Western intellectuals and scientists had to be approved beforehand by the party leadership. In the same way, the economy was planned. Cultural relations with the foreign countries were also coordinated. This institute was a political tool of Romania's Cold War cultural diplomacy. It activated under the aegis of the External Affairs section of the Central Committee, led by Gisela Voș. I must say also that the Romanian institutions officially encouraged the intense cultural context with Western progressive, communist-oriented intellectuals, but the Romanian agitprop and the external propaganda do not have much success in attracting Western intellectuals like the Soviet peers. Communist ideological offensive in Romania affected also the Romanian Jewish cultural and religious institutions, particularly after 1947. By the beginning of 1954, Israeli mass media was criticizing the Romanian government for the violation of both national minorities' rights and the religious freedom. As a result, the Romanian communist propaganda machinery promptly reacted upon. It is important to follow the entire decision-making process with regard to the Romanian response to this Israeli mass media challenge. In order to counteract to the so-called Israeli Zionist reactionary circles, Ion Tărăutu and the agitprop suggested that the Secretariat of the Communist Party should approve a plan with the necessary measures. Gisela Voș, Răutu, and Simeon Bughici, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, adopted these proposals during a Communist Party gathering. Afterwards, the three of them met the Communist press representatives, radio broadcasters, and the National Press Agency in order to establish their particular tasks of counter-propaganda. Later on, Răutu drew up the document containing the following proposals. Romanian broadcasting station had to start transmitting programs in Yiddish, and a commentary entitled "What are the real goals of the propaganda carried on by the Zionist chiefs?" And newspapers must continue to publish letters from Romanian citizens of Jewish origins who left from Israel and returned home to Romania. Obviously, the letters had to praise the communist achievements and to emphasize the economic hardships facing Israel. The plan of ideological retaliation also included the publications of brochures focusing on the situation of national minorities in communist Romania, their rights, cultural institutions, including the Jewish theaters and schools. The propagandistic materials encompassed also pictures with synagogues, rabbis, Jewish Romanian Stahanovites, and scholars illustrating both the freedom of religion and the complete integration of the Jewish minority in new communist Romania. A group of rabbis, headed by a chief rabbi, had to write also a letter addressed to all Jewish communities regarding the so-called campaign of calumnies launched against Romania. Some members of the Secretariat made objections, especially regarding the proposal to transmit data concerning Israel's role as a tool of American imperialism and the bad situation of Israel's economy. Probably even Gheorghiu Dej, the Secretary General, raised objection. One annotation, probably written by Dej himself on Rautu's document, underlined the questionable proposals and asked, is it really necessary to engage in official polemics? Eventually, the top party leadership decided to allocate the most parts in this counter-propaganda play to the representatives of the Romanian Jewish minority. After Stalin's death, in the context of cultural thaw, the intellectual life seemed dominated by the so-called spirit of Geneva. During this period of relaxation, Romania joined the United Nations and UNESCO. And after evident cases of cooperation during the Cold War, such as Geneva conferences and the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, the Romanian authorities were somehow forced to adopt addresses towards the Western world preeminently attractive rather than threatening. It allowed the idea of concession and compromise between East and West. The policymakers were compelled to temporarily abandon their mind, which were shaped by a dichotomic view, and to conceive a new cultural strategy towards the West. Nevertheless, the capitalist countries and the Romanian political refugees in the West remained the enemies. After the Soviet model in 1955, the communist leadership founded both the Romanian Committee for Repatriation and the newspaper The Voice of the Motherland, a Romanian imitation of the Soviet journal Galas Rodina, distributed among Russians living abroad. However, as one said, the Romanian communists have had to rethink their cultural policies concerning the Western Europe and to consider a soft cultural openness. The cultural strategists were aware of the cardinal importance of the normalization of cultural relations with France. Probably clarification in the policies of external relations section and agitprop occurred at the beginning of 1956, while accepting on behalf of the National Theatre in Bucharest the invitation to join the French Festival of Drama, also as a hope in the possibilities of negotiation with France and with some representatives of the Romanian émigrés in France. In the summer of 1956 took place an event which had many implications. For the first time, after 2 decades, the National Theatre accomplished a tour in Paris. 2 plays were presented. In fact, the 2 directors cast the most prominent actors and actresses of the Romanian drama. For example, Marieta Sadova, who had also important artistic connections, peers or relatives in French capital. The communist power attached at least 2 important ideological supervisors of the delegation. One of them was Pavel Câmpeanu, instructor and later head of sector within External Affairs Department of the Central Committee. He played the most important part in this ideological choreography of the Paris tour. At the end of the journey, he drew up a document called Information Concerning Some Problems with regard of this tour, which proved that he watched directly the 1950s strategies of control, infiltration, and instrumentalization of the Romanian exile community. I will jump to the conclusions. It is important to notice that the morbid fear of aliens' ideas and their bearers, a Soviet-type obsession, hindered after 1956 the emergence of a Romanian intellectual reform movement, somehow similar with the Czechoslovak group of writers, philosophers, and scientists who prepared, for example, the Prague Spring. It must be stressed that unlike the Czech and Slovaks intellectuals, their Romanian peers did not draw up and did not pursue the path of an anti-Stalinist critique with elements of alternative political conceptualization. It is true also that they did not find any support within the top party leadership, and the radical anti-intellectual repression wave at the end of the 1950s and the internal disputes within creative unions, universities, fed up by the communist regime, all these were crucial factors that favored both the instrumentalization of national feelings, an anti-Hungarian stand, as I said, after 1958, instead of interethnic intellectual cooperation toward reform, intellectual reform and ideological reform. Especially in the 1960s, Romanian intellectuals became prisoners of such cultural and national policies, as well as some of their peers abroad, Romanian writers with pro-fascist past, Vintilă Horia, for example. I do not have time to focus on his case. These intellectuals were prisoners of their own biographies. Although the Romanian communists did not have the Soviet huge resources and tools of foreign cultural policy, due also to these biographical vulnerabilities, it threatened to gain control of the Romanian exile community in order to struggle against critical reporting on communist Romania abroad. After 1958, 1959, for example, Hungary tried to use the Soviet ideological and diplomatic channel, that is Kremlin's mediation, to influence the improvement of the cultural rights of Romanian Hungarians, but the Romanian Communist Party top leadership refused to take Hungarian and Soviet advices. The Romanian communist officials suspected that the increasing cultural cooperation, book exchanges, educational collaboration, and so on, would favor the spreading of both Marxist, revisionist, and nationalistic tendencies among Transylvanian Hungarians. And the 1959 unification of Cluj universities, Romanian and Hungarian, was motivated by the need to correct the so-called concessions that allegedly favored, after 1945, the Hungarian minority and allowed its actions of solidarity with 1956 Hungarian revolution. From the Romanian communist point of view, the national question was solved in 1960. Therefore, this period of time, 1956-1960, could be also seen as a transition from the pro-Soviet and internationalist stand to a sort of Romanianization of communism with nationalistic aspects. Thank you.
Now, as you know from the announcement, this is a work in progress, so I know Christy will very much welcome your comments and suggestions. We're going to open it up and hopefully get a debate and a discussion going on what he presented. And where do you see, where do you suggest you take it from here? So, go ahead.
Just a small question. You talked about the... Okay.
Yeah, you
Do you hear me?
present yourself.
Okay. Oh. My name is Alexandru Leșanu. I'm a PhD student at George Mason University here. And I'm dealing with Soviet Union and especially Stalinism. My interest is were there any contacts between Soviet students in Romania? How many Soviet students were in Romania at that time? And if there were students from what used to be Moldavian Socialist Republic? Thank you.
Yeah, there were few Soviet students during 1950s, and there are not so much information regarding their situation in Romania. The most important phenomenon is migration of students, Romanian students, to Soviet Union, and they, as they returned to Romania, they were privileged students. But I do not find many cases of Soviet students studying in Romania. They were not encouraged by Moscow.
Follow up on this, and then I'll finish. Then, if they went to Moscow, did they meet? Obviously, they meet with Soviet students, and how there were contacts, or I mean, in what framework they were ideologically controlled or not? What language did they speak? Obviously, this is a huge question, but can you give some insights on this?
Yeah. Actually, the former Romanian president Ion Iliescu was a student in the Soviet Union, and the Romanian students in Moscow, Leningrad, or other Soviet cities had to gather within the so-called party cells and to report over their situation in the USSR, the ideological activities, the university activity, and their contacts with their Soviet peers were also under the supervision of those party cells, and was mandatory to report to Bucharest, to Agitprop and External Affairs Department from the Romanian Communist Party Central Committee.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Vladimir Tismananu, fellow at Woodrow Wilson Center. Christy, I think that perhaps, regarding your questions, between 1948 and probably 1964, when the last Romanian students were in the Soviet Union, were at the Party Academy. It's the last. So by 1962, it's over in terms of regular students, normal students. By 63, 64, you have the last ones who are studying at the Party Academy. And I can give you some names if you are interested. After 65, there are no Romanian students in the Soviet Union, with the exception of those who are specializing in Russian studies, Russian history, and I mean, very Slavistics, if you want. But that's it. Okay, so Christie's wonderful slip of the tongue, you know, they went to the United Soviet Union. Okay, so, okay, yeah, okay. Now, I'll try to say a few things, but I'm sure you can say much better because we've studied, we've even written some stuff together. But I think the audience would like to know, since you had to, you know, sum it up very fast, but the audience perhaps should know, is that in 1956 you mentioned that this tour, which was fantastic, it's a unique event of the National Theatre. We have here Christina Bejan, who gave a presentation at the Holocaust Museum about Marieta Sadova and her very checkered, so to speak, biography. I mean, this was a lady who was an active member of the Iron Guard, very involved in the Criterion Circle, very involved in the people around Ionescu and so on and so forth, who becomes a major participant in the Sovietization of the Romanian theater, becomes a major stage director and all the rest. She is assigned a number of tasks. And you'll tell, just in 3 minutes, if you tell us what happens, because in 1956, clearly the Romanian communists tried to establish channels to very famous Romanian intellectuals who are still living in Paris. Eliade was still in Paris. He left Paris at the end of 1956, okay, coming to the University of Chicago. Emil Cioran, E.M. Cioran, was in Paris. Eugene Ionescu was in Paris. The selection of the play, well, there were two plays I think they had. One of them was by Mihail Sebastian, with Marieta Sadova playing. Ultima Hora, the last hour, okay, which was very appealing to people like Cioran and Ionescu, who had been very close friends with Sebastian, so it was very well conceived. The same people also got some tasks. In 1958, they will be arrested, and it will be a very sad follow-up. Can you tell us a few things about what the follow-up?
Yeah. This Paris tour is very important because the External Affairs Department and the Agitprop established some ideological tasks also for the artistic delegation. For example, Marieta Sadova and, as Vladimir Tismaneanu said, received the task to talk with Mircea Eliade and with other Romanian emigre, and also Constanța Crăciun, who was a minister of culture in Romania, give her specific directives, and Marieta Sadova actually brought some books in Romania and left the book at the Agitprop and at the Ministry of Culture. But Marieta Sadova also bought in Paris important books of Mircea Eliade and Emil Cioran, the French-Romanian philosopher, and she gave these copies of the book to her friends, and if in 1956 she was an actor instrumental for the communists, in 1959 and 1960, he became a victim because the impact of those books spread within Romanian Bucharest intellectual circles, and she was sentenced to life in prison, if I remember, or 26 years jail. And she was accused, in fact, that during this tour received subversive, so-called, I do not remember the term, jingoistic or nationalistic books written, as I said, by Emil Cioran and Eliade. And the proof that she received the official tasks is a document published by Vladimir Tismaneanu and by me, and signed by Pavel Câmpeanu, a detailed report from Paris.
My name is Svetoslav Kirov, sociologist from Sofia University, currently University of Maryland. My question is related to the official interpretation during this period about construction of a Romanian identity. As far as I know, the official version is that Romanians are two elements that participated in construction of Romanian nations, settlers from the Roman Empire and local tribe Dacians. I remember that there were two Romanian movies made, I guess, in the 1960s, which is actually beyond your period, Column of Traian and Dacians. And my question is, during the period you analyzed, what was the official perception about how Romanian nation was constructed in the past?
Actually, at the beginning of 1950s, the official propaganda and the official historiography were somehow anti-Latin, anti-Roman, and the role of the Slavs was stressed. The Romanian archaeology was forced to dig and to find Slavs, and Slavs were a sort of the Romanian people, and together with Dacians and Romans, obviously, but the change, the historiographical change, begins with this moment of Soviet army retreat from Romania, 1958, and the academic treaty, the history of Romanians, the official history, is a sort of a witness of this shift, a soft pro-Roman stance in the Romanian historiography, and but the role of the Slavs was diminished actually more after 1964, after the famous Romanian declaration of independence from Soviet Union, and the role of the Latin language and the role of the Romans were stressed, and but after 1971-74, the regime favored a sort of Trachomaniac, pro-Dacian discourse, and this is obvious in the 80s.
Let me just throw a couple of suggestions out there myself, and then get back to the floor. The one thing that I was hoping to get more from your presentation, well, there were a couple of things. One was placing the changes of the cultural policy of Romania in the greater context of de-Stalinization, and you touch upon it a little bit, but I was wondering if you can put it more into the political context inside Romania and the international context outside Romania. There are a number of changes that you actually allude to as well in the early 50s, but those don't happen in a vacuum. They sort of happen because there's a greater movement in the Soviet bloc that takes place. The other thing that I was interested to hear more about, and again, you sort of alluded to it, but maybe you can speak more about it, are the changes in cultural policy as the Romanian foreign policy is beginning to normalize. In the late 50s, the contacts, the official contacts with the West, the membership in the United Nations, and so on. And lastly, and especially since you're here in Washington, I'd be very interested, and I'm hoping that you'll get a chance to do that as well, is talk about Western reactions, and specifically, American reactions to Romanian cultural policies. How did the White House and the State Department view Romanian cultural policy towards the West and inside the country? Were there specific policies directed at Eastern Europe, and how did those play in Romania? So, there you go.
Yeah. Actually, the American officials hoped throughout this entire decade, 1950s, they carried on a sort of a psychological warfare, and they hoped that with cultural propaganda, as it was in Romania, to break this wall of silence erected by the communist officials. The American officials try to influence the Romanian culture, but the worsening of the bilateral relations hindered their attempt at the beginning of the 50s. Actually, I saw a few documents at the National Archives at College Park, reports, materials signed by American ambassadors and in Bucharest, and I noticed a sort of a how can I say, sort of a message: Romania is lost. In this moment we cannot do much for the Romanians. Let's try to expect better days for the Romanian people. And the bilateral relations, the Romanian-American relations, at the end of following the Soviet and American softening in tone discourses, at the end of 1950s, the bilateral relations appeared a sort of understanding at the beginning of the 1960s, after the American exhibit in Moscow in 1959. About the de-Stalinization you talked about, I think in Romania there was not a real de-Stalinization. I think the adequate term is de-Sovietization, because I think the nature of the political regime doesn't change. It continued to be a sort of a totalitarian ethos, even during 1960s.
And first there and then over there. Excuse me one second.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Anka Hassing, and I can introduce myself as one of the probably very few, if any, other direct beneficiaries of the splendid period that Cristian studied and talked about today. but I want to give you a detail. It's a funny detail, but in a sense, it's a sad detail too. As part of the campaign of Stalinization, Sovietization, or whatever you want to say, the communist leadership of Romania decided to change, to give new laws regarding the Romanian language. The Romanian language is probably everybody who knows about Romania comes from two sources, indeed. One is Latin, and because of the Romans who came there and did whatever they did, but they left a lot of words. And then the other source is, a Slavic stock of words. But there is a certain percentage that has to be kept, and I'm not going to go into details. But there is one sound in the Romanian language that was represented in writing by two different letters with the same diacritical. So this is the sound for those who speak Romanian, they know it. For those who don't, they know it's a fairly hard to reproduce sound. It's U, just like in Russian, U. Well, this U was written as an A with a diacritical, which looked like a hat, and an I, like I in Romanian, with a diacritical, which looked like a hat. So the words originally, when I learned, I was in first grade, or it was a very clear separation of what was written with an A, what was written with an I. And normally, the words written with an A definitely came from the Latin stock. And the ones written with an I with a hat came from the Slavic stock. Well, it was not good enough for the communist leadership. So what they did fairly early, they changed the spelling. Clearly, there was no more written as an A. Everything was written as an I because that was associated with the Slavic source. The only word that they couldn't alter was Romania. Romania, because it's pronounced in Romanian, România, so that U sound, that remained written with an A. So it's just one of those things that probably you remember if you have had to live with it and live through it, because it was very difficult for all of us. So I think it took, if maybe Vladimir, if you know, you can correct me, I think it took a revolution, right, in 1989 for for a general, change into the old format. So that's kind of funny today, but on the other hand, so I don't have a question. I just have, that's my, being a beneficiary, I have to share with you all the goods. I think it's a wonderful idea to see young people, historians or political scientists, or taking up these subjects. I'm stunned by the lack of knowledge that young people, I'm not even talking about foreigners, because foreigners sometimes, if they study a subject, then they study it very, very deeply. And I'm stunned by Romanians who, if they are younger than, let's say 20 years, then they know very little. And not only that they know, like from here up, they feel very, very indifferent regarding what happened, before they got to be in a position to enjoy being here, to enjoy traveling, and to enjoy democracy, faulty as it is in Romania. So thank you very much, but I wish you good luck, because it's a wonderful, wonderful project. And do it as much as you can, and take it back to Romania and try to have people, remember and try not to repeat. If they take the example of the Holocaust, people remember and they are doing everything possible not to forget it and to spread it, to spread the word. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello. Okay, it's on. Hi, I'm Christina Bejan, and I'm a research fellow at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. I have two questions, Christy. But first, I want to say congratulations for a very thorough and fascinating presentation. My first is about, you mentioned the Jews of Romanian ethnicity who returned to Romania with the implementation of the communist regime. And I would like to know a little bit more about that group and what happened to them with the purge of the Jews from the Communist Party. So what was the impetus to come? What was the propaganda sent to them in Israel? And then what happened to them after their return? And then my second question is, you mentioned in 1955 the founding of the Romanian version of the newspaper for the diaspora community. And could you say just a bit more about that in terms of content, but also distribution and the impact it did or did not have in the diaspora? So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. About the Romanian Jews, the main focus of the repressive waves against the Jews were concentrated on the so-called Zionist and the Romanian communists somehow followed the attitude of the Soviet Union towards Israel, and after the creation of the state of Israel in 1948, and with the alliance of Israel with the Western states, the situation of the Romanian Jews worsened because of the Soviet policy, and after 1953, during the Soviet attempt to improve the relation with Israel, we can notice a changing in this policy, and as I mentioned, the Răutu's document from 1954 was somehow straightened, corrected by Dej himself, by the Secretary General of the Romanian Communist Party, Romanian Workers' Party, actually, and I will say just one thing. At the end of 1950s, the situation of the Romanian Jews worsened again during the purges within the party, but also within the Ministry of Foreign Trade, Ministry of Interior Trade. Many Jewish intellectuals from technical intelligentsia suffered during this period, 1958 to 1960. The second question about Romanian diaspora, I understand, and the influence of different groups. There were Romanians attached to liberal democracy. There were Romanians, former sympathizers of the legionary movement, the extreme right Iron Guard, and as I stressed, the latter were prisoners of their own biographies. I mean, the case of Vintila Horia, I do not have the opportunity to focus of this case. After 1945, he became a sort of a conservative, but his past was a fascist past, and his critics against the Romanian Communist Party were vehement and violent, but the communists had his file of commitment, of fascist commitment, and therefore they try to blackmail. This is the major problem of the Romanian diaspora, with segments of Romanian diaspora with this problematic past. Their discourse, their anti-communist discourse, is carried this burden of the past.
What about the communist propaganda within the diaspora? In the equivalent of the Soviet newspaper?
Yeah, the voice of the motherland, Glasul Patriei in Romanian. I think that its impact was not so important, but the quarrels, the disputes within the Romanian diaspora, and was the major factor of the Romanian diaspora.
Okay, just a couple of questions. Yeah, you and then over there. And
just
briefly,
wrap it up. I'm Mihail Neamțu from Woodrow Wilson, Romanian scholar. Thank you, Cristian. I just wanted, since I'm not a historian, I'm more willing to talk about the conceptual aspects of your paper. And since your paper is a work in progress paper, I should like to make maybe one or two suggestions. I think when you've mentioned the agitprop, one really should dwell a bit and try to explain to our, your contemporary readers what propaganda meant and what the agitation was. These are two distinct notions, and they have to be probably well differentiated. As I understand, in a very sort of agrarian metaphor, the agitation is the equivalent of plowing, and then maybe the propaganda is the equivalent of sort of seeding, putting the seed into the ground. But really, these concepts have to be dissociated, and maybe you could also talk about the way in which the propaganda functioned in Romania, so in the homeland, and also abroad. I think the strategies of this agitprop were different, and the question for me, for you, would be, in what way the agitprop was different when it functioned abroad, and it was more like Soviet-like when it functioned in Romania? These are the kind of questions I'd like you to think about for the future.
Thank you for your suggestions.
Right back there. No, there's a mic right there.
Very brief. We're out of the time. Tiberiu Dian from Diplomatic Language Center. Thank you, Cristian, for this very captivating lecture. Personally, I can hardly wait to see the final product on the market, to read in a book. Two brief questions. Can you emphasize again how important was the Arlus role in the 50s? Because this organization survived pretty well up to the late 80s, if I'm not mistaken. And the second, will the research in the final version will contain more information about the bilateral US-Romanian cultural relations in the 50s? Because in the presentation, there were not many, only Mircea touched a little bit in a question of his about this.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Regarding the ARLOS, the Romanian Association for the Strengthening of Relation with the Soviet Union, it was an important organization with spreading throughout the country. In every Romanian counties there were ARLOS, and actually in Bucharest they have an important headquarters in Bucharest, in capital city, and the House of the Friendship of Romanian and Soviet Friendship which survived until, if I'm not wrong, until 1989, but the most important part was only until 1960-64. It's important to say that during 1950s there were numerous purges within this organization, because many of its leaders were Romanian and Russian speakers from Bessarabia, and some of them were, interestingly, even former priests, and the purges hit them strongly. And Arles was a decisive organization for the spreading of the Russian language, and it must be stressed, this thing. I don't know if you... yeah, surely. I will focus also on the Romanian-American cultural bilateral relation, for sure. I studied and I copied numerous documents from the National Archives, and the final form of this paper will... yeah.
Well, hopefully that final version of the paper will make its way on the website of the History and Public Policy Program, the Romania Initiative, but there's still some work to be done on that. However, we're pretty much out of time. Thank you, Cristi, for a wonderful presentation.